hoping that that's the music that I am fading.
And
we're live. No, I can read it.
Okay. He's looking at
it's working. What up?
Hey guys.
People, welcome to Max and Ben Save the World, a men's mental health podcast.
Dude, is our video stream on?
Our video stream is not on.
Yeah, okay. Just was going to ask that question.
Our audio is live.
Seems kind of important.
And our video is live as well.
Good to see y'all. Glad you're here.
Yeah, glad to have you all.
Yeah, so welcome to Max and Ben Save the World, a men's mental health podcast. In this podcast, we like to talk about really cool things and also sometimes difficult things. You might disagree with some of the views in this podcast, but we encourage you to stick around even if they are views that you disagree with. Growth only happens when we have difficult conversations is one of our really core beliefs. Also, this podcast is not therapy. It's not a replacement for therapy. Also, go to therapy, respectfully. So, please just seek out your own therapist. Don't just, watch this podcast and be like, oh, this is my these are my therapist. No, that's not. We are licensed therapists. We're talking about mental health. But no, this podcast is not actually your therapy.
Not a replacement.
No.
Go to therapy.
Yeah.
Well, with that said, we've got our recognition for the day. And today, Max and Men Save the World wants to recognize the Alta National Park Service.
Yes, we do.
It's an organization of seemingly national park employees that are concerned that the current trajectory of government might threaten the abundant resources, or less abundant resources than we would like, within the national parks. And they have been using their voices to garner a lot of community engagement and not only spread memes on the internet, but it seems like those memes have turned into calls to representatives and letters to representatives, which we can only hope is going to have a positive impact in the natural resources that we have here in our nation. And we want to recognize those people for standing up even when it's hard, for doing the right thing, and that's taking care of our planet.
And I will say that the Alta National Park Service, at the very least, they are speaking their truth.
Yep.
No matter what, and that is something that I can absolutely respect.
Yeah. And they're posting some spicy memes for it.
They are, and I can appreciate some spicy memes, too.
Yeah. Speaking of spicy memes, you know what generated a lot of spicy memes in the last year or so?
I have no idea, Ben. What is it?
Dune!
Ah, Lisan al-Khaib!
Lisan al-Khaib!
Yes.
I'm riding a sandworm right now. You can't see it because my legs are cut off.
Yes, they are.
Yes.
Absolutely.
But Dune has been a popular franchise in recent media culture, we'll say.
Yes, I would say.
But Dune is not recent.
No, it's not.
Dune's old.
It's from the 1960s.
Yeah.
The original book, and there's a lot more books than just the first one.
Yeah.
I will say that I actually was familiar with the Dune series, but I really just knew that the spice must flow and that people's eyes were blue until Ben said last year, dog, you've got to go watch Dune 2. And then I was like, okay, I'm going to trust this guy, and we're going to go watch Dune and Dune 2, and I blew my fucking mind.
Yeah. I think I first became aware of Denis Villeneuve, the director of Dune Part 1 and 2, with the film Arrival, which I would also highly recommend. It is a really interesting, introspective film, which, spoilers for a film that's 5 years old, I'm just going to skip to it, has time travel involved, and it uses sci-fi as an excuse to ask a question of a marriage that... would you go through all of it again, even if you knew that your child would end up with cancer and you would end up divorced? And this person gains mastery over time through the mastery of their brain, and they make the same decision anyway. And it is a very fascinating question of the human soul and the human nature, and what it means to be a person, and what our identity is without that element of time. But that was, for the longest time, what I told people was the greatest film that I've ever heard. The musical score of Arrival was incredible. And
what
I think
about Star Wars?
Dune matched, and I think that Arrival
some
exists
John Williams
in the context, right? Everything, we didn't just fall out of a coconut tree.
John Williams walked so that Villeneuve's
Hans Christian Zimmer.
It was Zimmer
Yeah.
in that movie too.
Yeah.
Okay, so Zimmer and Villeneuve, because I know that Zimmer also did the Dune soundtrack.
Yep, and he's
they
also
must-
done things for who's the guy that did Tenet and in Inception, and I'm flicking this because of The Dark Knight. Christopher Nolan.
Yeah, sounds right.
Christopher Nolan has
Yep.
worked with him a whole bunch.
100% sounds right.
So I was really excited for Dune for that. But I would say, and I remember at the time you had not seen Dune yet. My reason for recommending Dune is I still to this day think that the character of Stilgar, as played by Javier Bardem,
Yeah.
is so good that even if you're not interested in, high fantasy space opera type shit, which if you aren't,
Well, I mean,
subjectives are opinions, but yours can be wrong. But even if you aren't, his character of Stilgar is so incredible in Dune Part 2 that I think the first movie is worth watching just for the anticipatory buildup of the amount of stage that he will take up.
well, and I
in
mean
Part
the
2.
acting, just overall, like Timothée
Incredible.
Chalamet is an absolute force. Really, I mean the scene in Dune 2 where, and we're gonna get into characters specifically,
sure.
but his speech to all of the Fremen in the South is is one of my top favorite scenes of all time in all of film. Now,
I'm who your
Yes.
grandmother's told you about.
yes,
Yeah.
yes,
Wild
and
stuff.
in
Wild stuff.
the other language, right? And I mean Chani, also Zendaya, absolutely wonderful in that role. I mean, you could really believe everything that she's saying. I really, really loved her work too.
I think I'm one of those people that is of the opinion that Zendaya is just a cardboard person
Okay.
in most of her acting roles, and I will concede
that
she does a
did
pretty good
well.
job in Dune.
Yes,
I
she did.
would also concede that while I did not like the film Challengers, she was pretty good in that too. Like
I did
she
not see the film
acted well.
Challengers.
I will admit, but
So all of this is kind of to say that we are talking about Dune and men's mental health today.
yeah, we're talking
and
about
how
Dune.
it relates, because I do think that a lot of young men and people generally related to the story of Dune, and I think that it's got a lot of renewed interest now, and we were really excited to kind of dive into it.
Yeah, yeah. So I have not read the Dune books. You talked a little bit about your experience with Dune. I'll share that I hadn't read them before. I had seen parts in my childhood. I remember, in my family basement watching on the old school curved television at
Yep.
some point some parts of
The original.
the
one.
original Dune, and I remember as a kid thinking that's Fred Flintstone's boss, because the guy that plays Paul Atreides in that movie is the guy that plays
Fred Flintstone's boss.
Fred
in the
Flintstone's boss in the
Flintstones.
live action Flintstones movies. Yeah, and there's people with stuff up their nose, and other than that, I really didn't know much. But being a nerd of the early 2000s, that was
The Sci-Fi Channel had kind of like their Dune series.
they had
and I
the
think
Dune series
They
going
had their
on.
own.
Yes.
Didn't they have their own Dune movie too? I'm pretty sure.
Yeah,
I feel like
they had
I'm
one that
showing
connected some,
my
yeah.
my cards that I'm also not a Dune super fan prior to the Villeneuve movies. I was certainly familiar with them. Again, knew The Spice Must Flow, Blue Eyes, Desert Planet. But yeah, didn't really know a whole lot more, and so was really just kind of into the movies. But have since picked up the books. Have not quite got through them with a lot of the PhD reading that I was doing last year. But yeah, so it sounds like we're both more or less movie watchers, really interested in analyzing the movie as it is and our knowledge of Dune lore otherwise.
I think most of our conversation then will be related mostly to what's been presented so far in film. Although we'll likely get into what we know happens in the future and things that Frank Herbert, the writer, spoke about the overarching narrative of the piece. Let's start right off the bat, though. We got another story here with the hero's journey.
We do, yes.
Paul Atreides has a bit different hero's journey than who did we discuss last
Aragorn
time?
and
Aragorn
Frodo,
and Frodo
Lord
last
of the
time.
Rings last time, right?
Yes.
So Paul's hero's journey does feel like a hero's journey. I mean, if you look at Dune 1 and you kind of start on his home planet, and he's hearing from I think that when the Bene Gesserit come and visit him, Lady Jessica, that's kind of like the calling of something is going to happen. And I did read the first chapter of the Dune book, and I will say that that's the scene is when he starts right there. So it does feel kind of like the calling of you have a great destiny that might be ahead of you, and I know that there is the part after that scene where Lady Jessica specifically tells his mom. I'm sorry, Lady Jessica is his mom, isn't it?
Yeah.
Right, and then
The Bene Gesserit. I'm forgetting the name of the lady.
and here we are. We're showing our cards, not necessarily big,
Yeah.
but the Bene Gesserit lady, who's kind of on top of everything. She tells Lady Jessica that her son might be the Kwisatz Haderach, which is kind of like a messiah from their idea of things.
Yeah.
And that's kind of like a calling there. And then Paul does go to Arrakis, and the interesting thing about Dune to me is that Paul's hero's journey is a little bit more morally ambiguous than say Frodo's or Aragorn's, where it's not necessarily clear that everything that he's doing is correct all the time, because the Bene Gesserit have been using propaganda on Arrakis, Dune, the Dune planet, for a very, very long time to kind of instill this idea that someone is going to come and is going to save them. And it's very much supposed to be kind of like parallels to a white savior idea that exists within sort of our culture, that only the white man can kind of come in, fix everything, and make it better.
Yeah, and part of Frank Herbert's purpose in writing Paul Atreides was a cautionary tale against Messiah figures, right? Whereas Paul is also, to call a spade, the inspiration for Anakin Skywalker. And the thing that got a young George Lucas excited and that made him go, I'm going to make a movie about a sand planet with a young boy that, becomes this messianic figure, was that he was reading Dune and got excited about this new way that Frank Herbert was presenting, that perhaps messiahs shouldn't be trusted. And that's one of the things that Frank Herbert, in many interviews and has been in many writings after Dune, has shared, is that one of his primary goals with Dune was to express that we should be cautious in who we choose to put into positions of leadership, and that things aren't always what they seem when it comes to who's chosen in leadership. I think you interestingly mentioned that we start with Paul Atreides on his home planet, and unlike many heroes' journeys, Paul Atreides starts in noble birth, in a noble palace, of a noble family.
That is a different piece there.
He's not a young boy from a farm. He's not a...
and he's not a Luke Skywalker.
No, he's not a Luke Skywalker.
Farm.
Yep, he's not on the moisture farm. He is not a Greek hero that hasn't tested himself yet fighting or wrestling with a boar in the woods. Yep. He is not, he's not blooded himself yet as a Dothraki blood rider, right? Like he's soft, and I think Timothée Chalamet really was a great acting choice, or a great casting choice in that. I think it's important to note that the cultural zeitgeist at the time was that Timothée Chalamet was this nepotism baby in Hollywood that hadn't had very many roles yet, and he was soft, and he's really, I think it's worth noting as an aside in the whole conversation about Dune, Timothée Chalamet, I think, is an argument for somebody that really has figured out how to handle stardom well, it seems.
Yeah.
He has grasped it and unapologetically wielded Beyblades at red carpet events. Gotten really deep into his movie where he's playing Bob Dylan, and unapologetically, played what was, according to the internet, and I mean, I listened to some of it, one of the best SNL performances that there's ever been. He was covering Bob Dylan's music. But at the time, especially Dune Part 1, when he was casted for that, he's this, someone I would compare to like an as of yet untested Tom Holland before he became Spider-Man. Mm-hmm. One of these, classically trained in a theater school actors, that, he was known for that Netflix movie with Robert Pattinson, mm-hmm. About the French and the English king, but that was about it. And I think that both in the casting choice, but also in that part of the movie, it's very interesting how unknowing to the world Paul is. Even if we had stayed as a setting on his lush jungle home planet with Caladan. Waterfalls of Caladan, he still would have been an inexperienced young man. But I think that, obviously there are some conveniences of narrative creation, that if Paul as your main character doesn't know that much about the world of Arrakis that he's going to, he can have a lot explained to him, and then the reader thereby gets things explained to them. Yeah. But we really get to see all of these nuances, these things like through the eyes of somebody that's really fresh to them. So the Fremen people of Arrakis are strange and mysterious at first because they are to Paul. And Paul is who we're following through Dune Part 1 and 2, at least. As we get into the books and it goes farther, there's more of this God Emperor of Mankind things that go on. But specifically for Paul the Messiah, he is our identified... He's the one that's going on that circle journey.
The hero's journey.
Yeah. He's going to go out of the village, go to the underworld, maybe meet a god along the way, find some newer forbidden knowledge and bring it back and make the world a better place.
And so I also think that Paul starts as a boy, but kind of becomes a man.
Yeah.
I feel like he looks up to, in Dune 1, like Duncan, very clearly, like the affection that he shows for him, how he's eager to go with Duncan on kind of like an adventure, how he's eager for manhood, but Duncan kind of like cautions him about doing some of those things. And then he's kind of forced into being able to do that with the murder of his father in Dune 1. Right. I do think that his father has kind of this interesting, like, Ned Stark sort of thing going on, where he's always trying to do the right thing, has actually amassed quite a bit of power with his house. Oh my gosh, why am I forgetting all the Dune... Atreides. Look at me, forgetting all the Dune things today. With House Atreides, he's built up so much power with House Atreides, and he's still finding that he's going to be given Arrakis, and then finds that his trusting instinct made him get killed ultimately. And so it's interesting because Paul sees this and has such a good reason to not necessarily be ethical in everything that he does in the future. And on one hand, I feel like Paul is ethical in a lot of the things that he does, but I also think that he abuses some of the unethical things that other people have done. I do think that when he goes south, he kind of abuses the propaganda that had really taken hold in the south area there of Arrakis. So,
one thing that I wonder about too, though, is if we could focus a bit of our mental health and masculinity brains at what are we receiving as young men if we're watching Dune, right? What is Paul teaching us, and what are we learning about? I'm drawn to, as you said, about Duke Leto dying early on is a part of Paul's hero's journey. Mufasa dying in front of Simba is a part of Simba's hero's journey. Obi-Wan Kenobi dying in front of
Luke
Skywalker is a part of his hero's journey. Robb Stark becomes the king in the North because his father died, not right in front of him, but because his father died in front of him. This seems to be a theme within heroes' journeys, and it seems, which to me, as a narrative-based therapist and as a story writer myself, it seems as though that means the fact that we have been writing stories about that for so long that it is unquestionably just a part of many heroes' journeys means that that's a pretty significant problem or question of what must a young man do without a guiding father figure. That has been a problem across history, across cultures, across timelines. And I wonder what Dune tells us about that.
It's a very interesting comment as a child therapist. I feel like there is a lot in our cultural zeitgeist right now about absent fathers and fathers not being there, and the father is dead or in jail or whatever. And what does that mean for a son who's needing to grow up as a man? How does he prove his masculinity? How does he become a hero in that way? That it's necessary that he becomes a hero in each of these circumstances. In The Lion King, Simba, tries to avoid it, but his path kind of finds him. In Star Wars, Luke, kind of stumbles onto being on the Death Star and doing the right thing there. It depends on the situation, but in the end, the person's past either kind of like catches up with them, or they choose to go on that path themselves. And I think that is really interesting. I think that for Paul, he's kind of knocked into a corner in the case of Dune. He doesn't really have a choice but to hide on, Arrakis, and then just hope that he's actually going to, kind of overthrow the Harkonnens someday, and do something meaningful.
I think he is, in the narrative as well, presented with several pseudo-replacement father figures. Stilgar being one of them.
Yep.
Duncan Idaho early on is one of them, and he loses him as well, right? Yep. But then also Gurney.
Gurney returns.
I'm thinking Thanos. What's his? Josh Brolin. Plays Gurney. Is also... I think that there are scenes, and I think that it speaks to how well acted it is. That Timothy Chalamet, I think at least, left the impression in me, in this viewer, that seeing Gurney again when he didn't know if he was alive or not in the second movie, I really got a sense of it was a part piece. It was getting a little bit of that fatherly love back, of that fatherly guidance back. Gurney is the one that taught him about knife fighting. Jean-Luc Picard plays him in the 1984 film.
Yes, he does.
And they have
Patrick
the blocky,
Stewart. I don't think it's Jean-Luc
Not
Picard.
Jean-Luc Picard, you're right. Patrick Stewart, who plays Jean-Luc Picard in
Star Trek.
Star Trek. Yes, has the blocky knife fight in the 1984 film, where he's teaching him about strategy as well. I think that it's interesting that Frank Herbert decided to explore this that dynamic, the dynamic between a young man without a father figure, and Stilgar is this semi-religious leader / community leader that takes him in and becomes then becomes his true believer, his first apostle or convert, what have you. And then you have Gurney is almost symbolic of the militaristic power that the great house of Atreides held,
possesses,
Paul lost, and then Gurney's the one that remembers or where the keys are to the shed where they're hiding all the nuclear weapons, which is the great fucking equalizer even in the future. And I think that it's interesting that Frank Herbert decides to give us moments where even though Paul is becoming this Messiah, we see him slowly try on and use questionably the voice, that his ability to speak commands into people more and more. And even as he's becoming that, we still get those character moments of reconnecting with Gurney. He's already well on his way to being, if we're comparing a Messiah journey, he's near the end of Jesus's ministry and heading to Israel. He's, Paul's arguable, wandering for 3 years and then going to the city ends with the taking of the city again.
And I will say, the father figures there, Stilgar, Duncan, Gurney, I feel like, especially Stilgar and Gurney, come in and are father figures to Paul after he's already kind of become, a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
And
that's true.
I feel like it, rather than, they kind of see him off and then they're gone, it's actually no, we're bowing down to you now. It's a whole different dynamic that I think is unique to Dune.
Mm-hmm.
Really embracing a young leadership thing, which is not seen in a lot of other heroes' narratives.
Yeah. And I think some of that is related to the difference or the uniqueness in the origin of being of noble birth, right? He is of, in this sci-fi world, he's
a prince.
He's a prince. He's a duke at the minimum,
Yep.
He is a duke, right? Other male figures, though, in Dune, we see the Harkonnens.
We do see the Harkonnens.
See a lot of the Harkonnens, and it seems like a feud between the men of these two houses is the central conflict of Dune.
Feuds between men, huh? Never have had any problems in the past in the entire world. It's interesting, the Harkonnens, not having successfully subjugated Dune, or Arrakis rather. It's given to the Atreides, but then it's a plot to eliminate the Atreides and their political power is what it actually is. But the Harkonnens, I find that I did watch 1984's Dune. Did you watch that?
Yes.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
love it.
So I also love it, but it's a lot more true to the book in terms of how the Harkonnens are portrayed. They're portrayed almost as like comic book ridiculous villains in like the 1984 version, whereas in the newer version they're portrayed as very hard, very very firm, men who abuse people and kill people for fun. And I will say that killing people for fun does seem to be a part of their vibe in the 1984 Dune as well, but it's all just kind of like
the plugs out. They
silly,
like shorthanded it
and ridiculous.
Yeah, I think they were really excited about the special effect of having blood spurt out of like a tube, and they just were like, full send, let's get 5 shots of that, and that was good enough for them.
That's what they wanted to do.
And I do think that it's interesting that the book, the 1960s book, does specify that there is sexual violence against people in the Harkonnen house, and that there are slaves that are mistreated and or even killed in sexual acts at the Harkonnen house. The 1984 film really. The 1984 film has overtones of sexuality in the same way that the Goblin King in Labyrinth does, right? I think Denis Villeneuve approached it in a different way of having the suggestion in a far more disgusting, gritty, muddy scene than the 1984 film did. And while neither of them necessarily fully express the violence that is attributed to the Harkonnens in the books, I think it's unquestionable that Frank Herbert puts forward this kind of ruler, this kind of behavior, this kind of excessive violence is clearly a form of evil that he is wrestling with in this narrative.
And I think that the way that it's gendered is really interesting and also important. I think that if you were to like take a faithful interpretation of the Dune book of 1984 Dune and publish it today, and you show the Harkonnens in exactly how they were back then, I think that it would be seen as homophobic, to be honest. That they're this kind of gay villains who do wild things and act effeminate, and it doesn't feel good. But to look at the Harkonnens in the way that Villeneuve did it, they're really a lot more kind of like in the toxic masculinity vibe of things. That strength, begets honor, and the Baron Harkonnen, tries to kill Fade Rotha in that arena, right? And that's very much like you have to be tough enough to survive, and survival of the fittest is the only thing that matters. And if you can't survive that, then you don't deserve to live.
I think something that was interesting, and I would suggest fantastical, part of the fantasy of the setting was Austin Butler's portrayal of Fade Rotha.
Did great. Very.
When he grabs Baron Harkonnen and kisses him on the lips, was such an interesting expression, and it was such a contrast for a literal black and white world that we were being shown at least for the newer films. That gentleness was a stark contrast to the violence and everything else that was all around them. Despite his uncle having just tried to kill him, there was still like this written into the narrative. You could sense, you could feel, and in the acting, you could experience. There was some way that in this twisted society, in this twisted family, that was an expression of love. His confidence that he would overcome the assassination attempt, and as such, the expression that you're my favorite nephew that comes from it was felt so overwhelmingly that he kissed him on the lips. And I think that Austin Butler captured the strangeness and yet interest and yet gentleness of that moment in a way that I think is also interesting to just stop and pause on. That like I think we want to. It's easy to I mean, no pun intended, make villains black and white, right? With like the movie had the planet be, but I think that there was some complexities and some nuances to this. I think Fade Rotha as this antithesis of Paul, as this opposite potential Messiah that they tell us at one point, in some of the dialogue of the movie, he was another potential Kwisatz Haderach.
Haderach.
Yes, and
They tested him with the box.
Yeah.
And, yeah.
And interestingly, we have this contrast with Paul, and we have this young man who we're given this glimpse of who he is within this system, and there's a part of him that you really kind of want to root for, right? Like you there's some level of, yeah, I mean, he's just like doing what he's only known his whole life. Yeah, he's a really shitty person, and it goes from there. But I think that that's part of what makes a compelling villain. I actually recently saw Patrick Page's All the Devils Are Here, a live performance of Patrick Page is a Broadway actor that's played lots of Shakespearean villains, and his kind of thesis of his whole one-man show is that Shakespeare, the reason his writing was so revolutionary was that Shakespeare's villains were some of the first villains in at least modern English writing that we had fully explored or in-depth backgrounds for. And I think that part of what Dune's strength is that the Harkonnens are unquestionably evil, but they're also very well explored. We're shown so much of them, and so much of them is made reasonable. Feyd-Rautha doesn't ever make irrational decisions. He makes what he would logically make if he was the young man that grew up in that society and was told what he was.
He didn't really know anything else.
And yet he is still evil. I think that's an interesting statement.
And still is an oppressor in a lot of ways. I think that it was interesting to me, the comment of he's sexually vulnerable by the girl who had assessed him.
Mm-hmm.
And, your comment on, he kissed Baron Harkonnen and made me go, oh, I wonder how they mean he's sexually vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
was interesting. But I do think that Shakespeare revolutionizing villains is an interesting thing to bring up because I always appreciate a story where the villain is unclear and it's messy and that the justifications are fully explored. And I think that the Emperor is a good example of that here, where this is a guy who's just kind of trying to rule the universe and is a little bit worried about the power that the Atreides are gaining, and he's not really sure if he can trust them to run the universe or do something good. And so he has them killed, which, is apparently was actually difficult for him because his daughter, the Princess Irulan, was saying that, he hasn't talked in, like the weeks after he did that.
Yeah.
Which to me it's interesting.
Excuse me.
And it also
it's
shows...
heavy is the head that wears the crown moment.
Yeah. And I also... it's an obviously unethical move, and I think that he realized that he had gone too far, and so it's hard to really hate him in that way. I look at him and I'm kind of like, well, that probably wasn't the right thing to do, but otherwise he doesn't do anything in the series that's like too awful or like too cruel like the Harkonnens do. Yeah, and so I think that he's an interesting character, but I also think that Paul, I understand, in Dune Messiah kind of becomes a little bit more of like that situation.
Yeah, the lore after the movies goes crazy. Again, spoilers for books from the 60s and 70s, but he has a son who he renounces. First, Paul renounces becoming the Messiah, wanders off to the wilderness. Potentially is another character that shows up a few books later, but his son, who's Leto II, named after his father, ends up fulfilling the messianic prophecy and actually melds himself with the water of life from the sandworms so much that small baby ones, because they have a different life cycle than organisms from Earth, little platelet-like sandworm trouts, I think they are called sand trouts, begin to have a symbiotic relationship with his body, and he attaches them to him until he becomes a sandworm who is sentient through time and able to communicate with himself at other times, and so he becomes this unmoving, living God Emperor of mankind that then must keep things happening in a universe where there are clones of people's entire memories planted into their bodies, and so another form of immortality. He ends up having to kind of come full circle and back to the tyranny of the original Emperor.
Well, and I think if you don't even go past Dune into God Emperor of Dune, you can take a look at Paul and how, if I go to the south, there's going to be a holy war and it's going to kill millions of people.
Yeah.
And
he's making tyrannical decisions.
And he's making tyrannical decisions, and he's kind of like, well, the Emperor sort of murdered my house, but if I do this, millions of people are going to die. That sucks, you know. And he doesn't really want to do that, but then again, like, part of you looks at him and wonders, is he like faking to like not want to do that when he thinks he's actually going to do that eventually, or is that actually how he feels? And you know, the therapist in me wants to look at Paul and say, I can see you really struggling with that. I can see you really struggling with the weight of that decision, that you don't want to become like the Emperor, that you don't want to become like the Harkonnens, but at the same time, you see that. And of course, one of the spoilers late in Dune 2 is that Paul actually has Harkonnen blood in him, which is kind of an interesting like thing, that, you know, the oppressor is within him, you know, kind of through his mother's side of the family.
Yeah.
So I do think that Paul does kind of become an oppressor, and the weight of that really appears in Dune Messiah a lot more, and then I believe he wanders off into the desert in like Children of Dune.
Yeah, that sounds right.
I did do a little bit of reading on like what it was, but yeah, and then I will say I'm interested to see in the third movie, you know, whenever that does come out, Paul's sister, played by Anya Taylor-Joy.
Yeah,
my dad loves Anya Taylor-Joy.
Oh yeah,
it's very
The Menu is one of my favorite movies of all time. I actually just watched it. My wife had not seen it. Just watched it again the other night.
I went to go see that with my dad.
Oh yeah,
yeah, good movie.
I think that's probably a good segue for our fun segment for the day. You have something to share about Pokemon Mystery Dungeon out here?
I do, Ben.
Okay,
So I'm not sure if a lot of y'all know, but Pokemon TCG Pocket is a very popular mobile game right now. And last week they came out with their newest release, Space Time Smackdown, based on Generation 4. And so I have a Generation 4 Pokemon story to tell y'all. Now, how does Pokemon relate to men's mental health? Well, I'm going to tell you, but I'm going to tell you at the end of this story.
Okay.
First, I'm going to have you imagine that you are transformed into a Pokemon.
Okay.
And that is already kind of ridiculous, but you're just going to have to bear with me. You befriend someone who has a mysterious artifact. They are scared, but they would like to join an explorer's guild that is somewhat nearby. Slowly, you begin to uncover a plot to destroy time as you know it, that would freeze time inside the world that you know. Someone is stealing the time gears that keep time going. It's a criminal named Grovyle who is doing that. Aided by Dusk Noir, a powerful Pokemon from the future, you work hard to apprehend Grovyle in the present. However, it is revealed that Dusk Noir was actually trying to ensure the future's destruction and attempts to eliminate the player by taking you to the future and capturing you. Motivated only by self-preservation, he and Primal Dialga, who is a legendary Pokemon, plotted to stop Grovyle and Grovyle's trainer, who is revealed to be the player, from traveling back in time to prevent the planet's destruction. If the world would be saved, their universe would be eliminated, and they would cease to exist. You and your partner, who has gained courage in the face of adversity, work with Grovyle to save the world. However, you hide from your partner that if you succeed, you will also cease to exist. In A Story for Children, we see important themes of self-sacrifice, gaining courage through adventure, and how morals fail if you are solely focused on self-preservation. What I really want to posit with this is that the stories that we tell our kids really matter. Ultimately, you look at Pokemon and, you know, I think about this Instagram reel. It's like, you know, what hobby makes a guy undateable? You know, Pokemon is the girl's interview choice, and then there's this guy who plays like the Pokemon theme on piano. It's really, really dope. And so I kind of identify with with that reel a little bit. But honestly, you know, I'm a child therapist, and I have no problem talking about Pokemon all day long. Like, it is a part of who I am, and I'm always going to be a Pokemon fan until the day that I die. But the reality is that the stories that we tell our kids matter. If we trust them with mature and emotional stories with serious lessons, they will grow accordingly. If we trust them only with superficial, authoritative answers to questions, like, you know, if they ask, why is the sky blue? And you just kind of say, no one knows. You know, it's not really encouraging curiosity or critical thinking now, is it? They'll grow up accordingly if you do that. And so, how would you choose to educate your children is really the thing that I would ask you. I wanted to kind of end with one quote from this wonderful, wonderful game, Pokemon Mystery Dungeon, Explorers of Time and Darkness and Sky. The important thing is not how long you live. It's what you accomplish with your life. When I live, I want to shine. I want to prove that I exist. If I could do something really important, that would definitely carry on into the future. And so, even if I were to disappear, I think that all I have accomplished will go on. that would mean that it's living, right? So I will say that story has a lot of personal meaning to me because I encountered that story when I was yet growing up, you really do have to experience the characters to a certain extent and see like the partner's journey from really being cowardly and being mugged by like Zubat, to becoming really a hero and really being their own self-starter. Um, yeah, I think that the character development in the game is really really good. So
That's really cool. That made me think of. I've not played Pokemon Mystery Dungeon. I've played one or two of the entries and not very far, but that reminded me of a game I know I've definitely said that you should try out before. Now I can't remember the name of it. It's not Sun and Stars. Sea of Stars.
Sure.
Sea of Stars came out a couple of years ago, and it's a modern group of like 4 or 5 people kind of made a love letter to JRPGs like Chrono Trigger.
Sure.
And specifically like Chrono Trigger has, and seemingly I guess like Pokemon Mystery Dungeon has this time travel mechanic thing, and really this narrative that comes to the question of, if you knew that things could be different, would you make the same decisions? And like we talked about with Arrival, even of that, making the right decision even when it's hard, even when it's temporally difficult. That reminded me of that, because there's some really cool moments. I think in one of the ways that it sends that love letter to JRPGs, it has a very famous moment similar to Final Fantasy VII, which if you've played Final Fantasy VII,
you know who dies.
There's a big death turn. That game really plays with its time travel and its JRPG trope of, surely they wouldn't actually kill a character, would they? Oh yes, they would.
Yep.
It's very good. But also the bit that you had there about it being important what stories we share with children reminds me of an interview that I read. Well, as it was a dialogue between J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, wherein C.S. Lewis said that he was aware that he could write for a more adult reader. The reason that he chose to write fantasy books about knights and dragons was that he wanted to give children stories where there were knights that overcame dragons, because by the time they were adults, they would find that there really are knights and dragons out in the world, and oftentimes the dragons win. And so in his books, he wanted them to know that they could be the kind of knights that would grow up and overcome and slay those dragons.
And what's interesting about even this journey is that it is a hero's journey in a lot of ways. That there's a calling from a divine artifact that what turns out is the partner's artifact that you discover. It's the key to the hidden land where Dialga resides. Which is
the tears of the goddess that take you to the end of the world.
The place that you have, the place that you have to go in order to beat the game.
Yeah.
Where Grovyle sacrifices himself by taking Dust Noir to the future so that you can go on and fulfill your destiny to stop Primal Dialga from existing. I do think that it's very much another kind of iteration of the hero's journey, but I was also thinking, we've talked a few times today about sort of this time travel like element, and
Dune even has it,
and Dune does end up having it,
Paul sees the future, and he sees that more death, he reasons with himself, more death would happen if I don't kill all these people.
If I don't kill all these people. Yeah. It seems so absolute once he becomes the Quetzalcoatl. Like he's so certain all the time, which is very a masculine confidence. But before we circle back all the way to Dune, I wanted to just kind of ask the audience, and you, I guess I'll ask you, Ben, and then the audience can respond in the chat if they want to. What is a decision in your life that you would consider going back and changing? And if so, why would you go back and change it? Or why would you not change it? Which I think is a really big question.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you have to think about it for a minute.
No hesitation. I've got it.
He's got it. Okay.
The answer is no. I would not change a single decision in my life thus far.
Is there
and mostly because I think that my life, I think that in any way that I could impact the series of events that would have resulted in me meeting my wife, I would want to avoid that. And so there's nothing that I would go change before meeting my wife. And I know, and I'm somebody that personally, I think that it would be very easy for me to say I would make different decisions in undergrad. It took me 5 years to complete undergrad. and I didn't. And then I had to go take some more at a different college and transfer credits over. And yeah, that sucked.
Yeah.
And yeah, that cost a lot of money. And yeah, that was a really confusing time in my life when I didn't know where I was going or what I was doing. But if I hadn't done that, I would have never met my wife, Allie. And that makes all of everything before that is simply a caveat with a comma at the end of it that says, and then he met Allie. And so kind of to me, I wouldn't change any of that, you know? I don't think there's a conceivable way that I could tweak any of those gears to meet Allie sooner, because I think I had to fail a few times in life in order to succeed. Yeah.
I think that's so beautiful. I'm sorry.
Well, thank
I'm
you.
Gonna cry a little bit.
It moves me when I talk about it too much.
As your friend Ben, and I know we're live on the air. I guess when you talk about your marriage, I want you to know how inspiring that is to me, about how much you respect your marriage as your friend. So
I really like it. It's neat.
I wasn't even expecting. I was digging, and I was just like, I don't really know what I'm gonna get from Ben right now, so I'm just gonna dig. But I dug, and I found like just the most like wholesome.
We got a damn in the chat from the wife, everybody.
that this guy respects his marriage. And
I really do.
That is so fucking beautiful.
Well, thank you. Yeah,
it's really beautiful.
I say quite often that I think that my only argument for whether or not I've ever experienced anything magical in my life was being in that group of people on my wedding day, wherein whatever happened there, whatever we all said, whether there was any magic to the words, something moved, and my life has been better ever since. Yeah.
Cool. Good. Love you, man.
Yeah. Love you too, man. Did you have anything that you would change?
I'm not sure.
Sorry. Yeah,
I feel I
kind of destroyed the stage.
No.
I lit it on fire as I walked out.
It's a bad. But I think that kind of organic conversation is what I'm looking to have on this podcast. Honestly,
absolutely.
I was thinking of my answer when I was even asking the question if we are going to go there. I think about my kind of obsession with, how can I improve, masculinity for the world? Growing up, I didn't really feel like I was a lot like the other boys. I really didn't fit in. I didn't like sports. I would wear jewelry to school a lot of times. And it took me a very long time to feel like I really fit in somewhere. And I know that because of the events that happened, I have a life purpose today. That I have a life purpose to help men and boys grow up to be the best they absolutely can be. And that is the purpose of my life, in my heart and in my soul. And I know that if I were to go and fuck with that thing, which interestingly is the thing that tempts me the most about going back to the past, that I would... my life would be on a totally different path, and I don't trust what path that would be, and so no, I would not change the past. And I'm sure folks who will be on YouTube watching this afterwards may be questioning, kind of like, what is that moment that I would go in the past and I would consider changing, and would you change it? And I guess for me and Ben, it sounds like we're not changing that fucking shit, because it gives us a little bit of the meaning in life.
I think that one thing that I'm really hearing in what you're saying is that I think you would agree with what I'm about to say, and that is, I don't think I would go back and change anything for myself. I'm fine with where I am. However, I'm very aware that the adult that I am today, and I'm proud of the fact that the adult that I am today would treat me differently in those times in my life.
Yeah.
That I have grown to be the adult that I needed when I was 12 years old, when I was 15 years old. And well, I can say I don't, because of that, obviously, intrinsically, that means I don't wish that upon another young man. But I am a pragmatist when it comes to the awareness that relative suffering is necessary for the formation of a human being. And so without suffering, we wouldn't have many components of our purpose.
Yeah.
According to Viktor Frankl.
There is the psychological concept of effort justification, that if you have suffered through something, that you're kind of committed to that thing now a little bit, which can, if you're gambling, that can actually kind of be sort of a problem a little bit. Yeah. But if you have, worked on a project for so long, like I remember a role when I was the lead therapist in a school district, and I really poured my heart and soul into the program and ended up leaving the position, that was really hard for me. That was me saying, I built this program and I'm going to look at it and I'm going to leave it because I have an opportunity an opportunity that would pay me more to do less work, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And like sometimes you just have to make a different decision there. And yeah, you know, I wouldn't change any of the decisions that I made in my past because it kind of made me the man that I am today. And there's not really anything else to say about that.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, you know who I think would probably change some decisions is probably late in his life, Paul Atreides.
So I suppose our final question, as we're kind of looking at this, is
who is right?
Who's right? Yeah, is
Who's
Paul
right?
right? Yeah, it sounds like you got some thoughts.
Man, I don't know. Honestly, who's right? I think this is a good question. I think it's fun because it's 3 words and can be interpreted so many ways.
I'm glad you like those 3 words that I just wrote in there. I was like, who's right?
Who was right about Dune? Well, I mean, from a certain point of view, to quote Obi-Wan Kenobi, I honestly, my gut is really saying Lady Jessica. I think that Lady Jessica is the most correct character. Yeah,
I
think she's
felt
the
differently
most
about
correct
that.
character in the whole thing.
I felt like she was a little bit more like corrupt and like I'm gonna try and influence the people in like the bad way. I'm gonna do the propaganda. I'm gonna call the people down south and be like, "Hey, girl, can you just like brainwash everyone down there a little bit more?" Like,
well, I don't think that she was.
That's kind of what she did.
I don't think she was just calling up people saying, "Hey, girl, can you brainwash people down there more?" I see Lady Jessica as making the willful choice to go against the monastic order of witches that she had been raised in.
Sure.
And out of love for her husband, first of all, we learn that out of love for her husband, she denied her monastic order of witches, the Bene Gesserit. She denied having a daughter for them. She had a son because that's what her husband wanted. And then she uses the years and years of work that she knows her secret order has put in to elevate her son to a position where he can get revenge for the death of her husband. And he can raise this big middle finger to the Bene Gesserit structures that are holding up the Imperial Society. I think from my point of view, it seems like Lady Jessica really took ride or die for her husband very literally. And when they murdered her husband, she said, "Fuck it. My son is going to be the Messiah. I'll make him one. And he's going to get revenge for them killing my husband." And I think that she made those calculated decisions on whether or not what is the best path forward for survival of her unborn child and of her young adult child. And she was like, you know what? I'm going to say the things and do the things that he's not willing to do for him to help him get where he needs to be. And the best and most protected place that my son and my daughter can be is if I can successfully get my son to lead this revolution and overthrow this government. And she did that.
She did it.
She succeeded.
Which is interesting.
Don't you dare kill my husband. I'll raise his son to avenge him.
We do see it in similar ways. I do see Lady Jessica a little bit more as like vengeful.
Oh, 100%.
Manipulative.
Yeah, but I think she's
to
right
me,
to
I
that
look
vengeance.
I look at the vengeance and I go like not so much. I look at Paul and I go, I'm a little more sympathetic towards Paul. I feel like Paul to me is the guy who was like, he was really trying to do everything right. And even though some of his methods weren't perfect, he did the right thing. And I look at him and I go, well, you know, he really wanted to liberate the Fremen of Arrakis. And yes, he had feelings about his dad, but ultimately he was liberating a people that had been oppressed for thousands and thousands of years and also changed a difficult system that was occurring with the Emperor currently in place. And, you know, I think that he kind of pulls up the middle finger. But Lady Jessica, you know, is sort of behind him and feels a little bit more like manipulative to me. And so I feel like her justifications were more just like, you know, I need to see.
I think they're more real though. I think they're more raw. They are less contrived. I don't think that Lady Jessica is out to have complete control of the Empire. I don't think she's out. She doesn't want to be the Empress. She doesn't want all the money from Arrakis. She doesn't want the
Paul
notoriety.
wants all the money from Arrakis.
Right? No. I think that's why he's I think that's why he's an anti-hero and not a villain, right? But I don't think that Lady Jessica has any of these ulterior motives. They killed her husband. Fuck it. I'm here for that. And I love that way that character dynamic shows up in George R.R. Martin's A Game of Thrones with Lady Stoneheart, Catelyn Stark, and Robb Stark. When Ned Stark is killed, Robb raises the North, and he says, "We're gonna go burn King's Landing down," and everybody in the North believes him. I love those narratives. I think that to me is one of the purest and simplest forms of human emotions, and of one of the, I think to me that's almost like it's a blunt stick in conversations about morality. At the end of the day, right, we can have all of these high conversations about
an eye for an eye makes everybody blind. Exactly,
the trolley problem, all of these things, and yet we are also still a tribalistic, simian species, and sometimes you kill my dad, you kill my husband. To quote Kendrick Lamar, "Fuck yo, truce."
Yeah.
Sometimes it's just on, and I think that's Planet of the Apes also captures this in several of its films quite well, and I think that series being about apes is not lost on me, on how primal
sure.
that feeling is.
We are apes on the inside. I think that as a person, I'm someone who kind of respects like the evolved sensibilities a little bit. That if you are trying to do the right thing and trying to make everything better, rather than getting vengeance, that to me, that's the thing that I will respect the most. I actually find that vengeance is something that I have somewhat of a disdain for. Like if someone is really hung up on, I really need to get this person back for this thing that they did to me, and they've been holding on to it for years and years and years. Besides like if it's litigation for your father's murderer, like okay, that's something to pursue. But if you are letting that eat you up from the inside and let that really just like do everything for your whole life, I think that is not a good and happy way to live. I think about the film The Northman, where he is trying to get revenge for, I don't know if anyone in the world has ever seen that movie, but really excellent movie. I'm a hoe for Vikings
Ari Aster film.
Yeah. But he's trying to get revenge for his father, like the whole movie, and he has this opportunity to leave with, again, Anya Taylor-Joy, to go be with a family for the rest of his life, and he chooses not to do that, and he effectively chooses to go and battle his father's killer in a volcano and die in the process. It's just kind of like, okay, yeah, I mean, vengeance takes you eventually. That's the
I think
reality.
There's art in the expression of that reality, though. I think that's a part of what makes it art, is we can forget how compelling that can be, and I think that art allows us to explore the consequences without actually going and dying in a mountain. We can think about that. We can think about that cathartic release without actually having to experience it. And I think, I would argue that like Paul and Lady Jessica kind of channeled that negative energy of vengeance into him becoming a messiah and taking over an empire. Not everybody can do that. Right? I think that your reality that you're expressing is very apt. Right? I think that if in our everyday lives we're allowing, arbitrary vengeances to overtake what we think ought to be, and I think that Marsha Linehan, the creator of DBT, actually spoke at great length about when we think about what things ought to be, we often get stuck in those modes and in perseverating on the ways that things should be different, rather than living in a pragmatic and real,
being present in what you've got today,
of what's in today. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so I think that Paul's right, and you think that Lady Jessica's right.
Yeah, I think Paul's right as well. I just think from a certain point of view,
choose the best answer to this multiple choice question.
Yeah, they're all awful people. That's my excuse. With 3 minutes left, I'll just pop the top off of as well. We didn't talk about Robin Harkonnen. Raven.
Yeah. I
played by Dave Bautista, the absolute, the sweating, juicing muscle of. I think that we'd be remiss as a men's masculinity podcast to not talk about that expression of cruelty, of physical power, of prowess, of abusiveness that men in leadership positions can have. if we just didn't talk about that, then we would be remiss, as I said.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because he, you kind of look at like Baron Harkonnen, and Baron Harkonnen is not a physically fit man. He's actually, it's central to his character that he's sickly.
Yeah,
and that he's dying, and that
large
he's grotesque,
gluttonous.
He levitates because he's got some weird like I'm sick like device on him, so he flies. It's like, okay, that's fine. I know in the 1984 Dune he had like the boils that were like popping and whatever.
Yeah.
It's a part. Yeah, he's sickly, but what's interesting is that Rabban is this big muscle guy who's kind of doing like the Baron's bidding because he's got the political power. But ultimately, if you were in, caveman society and, looking at, these two guys, Rabban could have been like, nah, fuck you. And just like tapped him in a way. But I think it's also to speak of a lot of times the hired muscle really is, simping for some kind of power that's going on. That, as you grow as a man, some people will only seek power, and that power is the only truth that they know. And, I do think that I feel sad for someone who really thinks that power is the only truth that they really know.
Yeah. Interestingly, when you bring that dynamic up between Rabban and Baron Harkonnen, I had never made this connection before, but I realized that it's very similar to the component of the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which is the Chinese history of like 400 BC to 200 BC. The General Dong Zhuo, who gained political notoriety for the beginning of the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. The Three Kingdoms are Wei Wuxiu.
Yeah.
Right? Dong Zhuo is a general of none of those three, that prior to those three kind of coming to power, Cao Cao with Wei was already in power. But I digress. Dong Zhuo is one of these guys that helped kick out the Yellow Turban Rebellion, and the Emperor really enjoyed. And he was notably in the story and in Chinese history as we have it written down, is this, very portly, gluttonous man who was successful because of Lu Bu, the character who, is a Herculean character in Chinese mythology. He is the Chinese version of that Viking on the bridge that held off 600 men. Right. All of those stories are Lu Bu stories in the East. And Lu Bu is famously this warrior that does realize, I could just kill this guy and I could lead the army. And famously, it does not work out well for Lu Bu, because just because you're the strongest man in the room doesn't mean that you are capable of running a country or a county even. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But he does end up with the prettiest lady, and questionably whether or not he dies.
Okay.
Yeah.
I wasn't familiar with that story.
Yeah, Lu Bu is the shit. Dynasty Warriors, he is like the first.
Oh, yes.
He is always the boss. That is the first one that, like, in this game, that otherwise you are mowing down waves of enemies with a single button press. He's the first boss every game that just absolutely rocks your shit. He kills you the first time you meet him, every time, and that really adds to how badass he is in the story and in the book as well. Is just how true to the story they are with the games about that one. With that, though, I think we're just gonna close this all out with a quote from Frank Herbert.
Absolutely.
Something that Paul says to himself, but I think is not unworthy of us reciting here, because I think that there's a message found inside the Litany Against Fear by the Bene Gesserit that we can all hear. I must not fear. Fear is the mind killer. Fear is the little death that brings total obliteration. I will face my fear. I will permit it to pass over me and through me. And when it is gone past, I will turn the inner eye to see its path. Where the fear has gone, there will be nothing. Only I will remain.
Yeah, I can't help but comment on the quote.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Just looking at that, two things come to mind. One, I think about a very famous speech by, I believe it was FDR, about we have nothing to fear but fear itself, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then two, I think about, as a therapist, if you're treating anxiety, a lot of times, like, exposure is what you do. I think that sometimes we're really tempted to just kind of, like, accommodate to our fears and never actually face them. And I had a very, impactful trainer on me who taught me how to do a trauma-based intervention, say, don't really collude with avoidance. If you collude with avoidance, that's a part of the problem. So there's an extent to which we all have to really face our fears. And I think that in the hero's journey, I think that facing your fears is fundamental.
Yeah. I think that this quote also reminds me of something that I think George R. R. Martin did a service to anybody that reads his books, is that early on, a conversation between a father and son, Ned Stark and Bran, is that Bran says, one day when I grow up, I want to be brave like you, father. And his father says, that's unwise. Being brave is not the absence of fear. The only time that a man can be brave is when he does feel fear.
Yeah.
And I think that is an important message to share with all men out there, no matter what you're struggling with or what you might be afraid of. The only time that you can be brave is when you're afraid.
Yeah.
And with that, that comes to a conclusion of our show. Thank you for joining us and talking about Dune today. We'll see you all again in 2 weeks, where we're probably going to discuss Epic the Musical.
Ben is so excited about it.
I'm freaking stoked.
He was talking to me for like 10 minutes about Epic is so cool, Max.
It is
the podcast.
really cool.
It's a musical based on the Odyssey, and I think we've been on this hero's journey kick, and we are just gonna dive right into the origin.
Alrighty.
So
the hero's journey.
We'll see you then.